Florence, a city bathed in the golden light of the Renaissance, held secrets darker than its shadowed alleyways. The Medici, a family whose name was whispered in awe and fear, were not just bankers or dukes. They were master manipulators of power, art, and destiny. But even for them, death was no quiet exit. When the Medici drew their last breath, the grand palaces of Florence often became a stage for bitter family feuds, shocking betrayals, and furious battles over vast fortunes. These were not just squabbles over gold. They were clashes that could change the fate of an entire city, a duchy, or even the very soul of a historical legacy. Uncover the dramas that unfolded when the Medici faced their final reckoning, and the legacies they left behind became battlegrounds. Number 7, the final farewell of the matriarch. Maria Luisa de Medici, the Electress Palatine, stood as the last direct heir of the Grand Ducal branch of the mighty Medici dynasty. Her life had been one of royal marriages, a challenging union with the Elector Palatine Johann Wilhelm, and a deep, abiding love for the city of Florence and the artistic treasures her family had amassed over centuries. Born in 1667, she had witnessed the slow decline of her illustrious house, a gradual dimming of the star that had once shone so brightly across Europe. Her father, Cosimo the Third, and her brother, Gian Gaston, had both failed to secure the family's future through legitimate heirs. The political landscape of Europe had shifted dramatically, and the great powers had already decided Florence's fate. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany was slated to pass into the hands of the Habsburg-Lorraine family upon Gian Gaston's death, a fact that deeply pained Maria Luisa. She understood the historical currents, but her spirit, as fiery and unyielding as any Medici before her, refused to let her family's incredible legacy simply vanish into a foreign treasury. The Medici had not just collected art, they had commissioned it, inspired it, and nurtured the very genius of the Renaissance. Their palaces, their galleries, their chapels overflowed with masterpieces by Botticelli, Michelangelo, Raphael, and countless others. These were not mere decorations, they were the very identity of the Medici, their claim to immortality. Maria Luisa knew the value of these objects not just in gold, but in the spirit of Florence itself. Her brother, Gian Gaston, the last Medici Grand Duke, passed away in 1737. With his death, the long and storied reign of the Medici officially came to an end. This moment should have triggered the immediate transfer of the entire Medici patrimony to the incoming Habsburg-Lorraine family as dictated by international treaties. However, Maria Luisa had been busy. Years before, she had quietly, deliberately, and with immense resolve, crafted a document that would defy the expectations of all of Europe's ruling houses. This document, later famously known as the Patto di Famiglia, or Family Pact, was her ultimate declaration, her final grand stand. Signed on October 31st, 1737, the Family Pact was not a typical will that merely divided personal wealth among relatives. Instead, it was an astonishing legal instrument that declared the immense artistic, cultural, and scientific collections of the Medici family in Florence to be inalienable. This meant the entire collection, the paintings, the sculptures, the jewels, the libraries, the scientific instruments, even the architecture of the palaces themselves, could never be removed from the city of Florence. It stipulated that these treasures must remain for the ornament of the state, for the utility of the public, and for attracting the curiosity of foreigners. The incoming Habsburg-Lorraine rulers, represented by the young Francis Stephen of Lorraine, husband of the formidable Maria Theresa, were not amused. They had expected to inherit everything, to have the freedom to sell, disperse, or transport any part of the vast collection as they saw fit. They saw the Family Pact as an audacious act of defiance, a direct challenge to their new authority over Tuscany. The value of the Medici collections was incalculable, and owning them outright would have been a significant boost to the Habsburg treasury and prestige. Maria Luisa, however, had foresight. She knew that the Habsburgs would be reluctant to antagonize the Florentine populace too deeply right at the start of their new rule. She leveraged her position as the last Medici and her deep popular support in Florence. The pact became a non-negotiable condition for cooperation in the transfer of power. She would facilitate the transition, hand over the keys to the Grand Duchy, but only if this singular condition was met. The Habsburgs, faced with a determined matriarch who held the affections of the people and the symbolic weight of centuries, reluctantly agreed. They understood that attempting to override the pact might provoke unrest and undermine their legitimacy in a newly acquired territory. Thus, when Maria Luisa de Medici died in 1743, 6 years after her brother, her final will and the preceding family pact were not just documents of inheritance, they were a revolutionary act of cultural preservation. The contention was not a legal battle in a courtroom, but a subtle yet profound clash of wills between a dying dynasty and a new ruling house. Maria Luisa, through her shrewdness and fierce devotion to her heritage, ensured that the unparalleled artistic patrimony of the Medici family remained intact, forever bound to Florence. The millions of visitors who flocked to the Uffizi Gallery, the Pitti Palace, and the Bargello Museum owe an immeasurable debt to her audacious foresight and her unwavering commitment to art, a commitment that defied the political and dynastic expectations of her time. The treasures that define Florence's artistic glory exist today largely because of her final, unyielding stand. Number 6. The weight of a father's crown. Cosimo the First de Medici, known as the Grand Duke, had reshaped Florence with an iron will and a keen intellect. Born in 1519, he rose from a relatively obscure branch of the family after the assassination of Duke Alessandro, securing the Florentine state and transforming it into the powerful Grand Duchy of Tuscany. His reign was long, stretching from 1537 until his death in 1574, and marked by political consolidation, military strength, and continued artistic patronage. He had systematically built a centralized state, established a powerful navy, and navigated the complex web of European alliances with cunning. His primary concern was the perpetual continuation of his dynasty and the secure succession of the Grand Ducal title. Cosimo had many children with his beloved wife Eleonora di Toledo and later with his second wife Camilla Martelli. His eldest son, Francesco, was the designated heir, groomed from a young age to take on the immense responsibilities of the Grand Duchy. However, the relationship between Cosimo and Francesco was often fraught with tension. For Francesco, while intelligent, was seen by his father as less decisive, perhaps too inclined towards quiet scientific pursuits and alchemy, rather than the hard-nosed politics that Cosimo believed were essential for ruling. Cosimo, a man of immense power and control, found it difficult to relinquish authority even to his own son. As Cosimo aged, his health began to fail, exacerbated by the grief of losing several of his children, including his beloved Eleonora, to various illnesses. In 1564, a decade before his death, Cosimo decided to officially abdicate from active rule, transferring after rule. This was an unprecedented move for a European monarch at the time, yet even in abdication, Cosimo did not truly let go. He retained the title of Grand Duke, continued to reside in the Pitti Palace, and maintained significant influence over state affairs. Francesco, while nominally the ruler, often found himself making decisions only to have his father subtly or overtly countermand them, or offer unsolicited, often critical advice. This created a peculiar dual monarchy, a constant source of quiet friction and uncertainty within the court. Cosimo's will, in this context, was less about a formal document and more about the deeply entrenched system of governance he had established, a system designed to ensure the Medici continued their rule for generations. His passing was not expected to be a contentious struggle over assets or titles, as Francesco was the clear heir. The contention stemmed from the very nature of the handover. Cosimo's meticulous control and his reluctance to truly empower his successor created an atmosphere of uncertainty about who truly held power even after his official abdication. Courtiers and foreign ambassadors often found themselves in a difficult position, unsure whether to appeal to the aging, powerful father or the technically reigning son. Upon Cosimo's death in 1574, Francesco formally assumed the full powers of the Grand Duchy. Yet, the legacy of his father's long and dominating rule cast a long shadow. Cosimo had left behind a meticulously organized state, a vast treasury, and a formidable military. However, he had also bequeathed a pattern of governance where the ultimate authority, even after a supposed abdication, always seemed to reside with him. Francesco struggled to emerge from this shadow. His early years as Grand Duke were colored by comparisons to his formidable father and the lingering perception that he was merely filling Cosimo's very large shoes rather than forging his own path. The inheritance Cosimo left was not just the Grand Ducal title and the wealth of Tuscany. It was also the immense pressure to live up to the standard of a ruler who had single-handedly resurrected and elevated the Medici name to unprecedented heights. The contentious aspect of Cosimo's inheritance was not a dispute over who got what, but the immense psychological and political burden placed upon Francesco, who had to navigate a realm still largely defined by his father's genius, and a court accustomed to Cosimo's absolute command. This inheritance of power, coupled with the lingering ghost of paternal influence, proved to be a challenging legacy for Francesco to manage, shaping the initial years of his reign with a subtle but persistent undercurrent of paternal expectation. Number 5. The bloody legacy of a brother. The assassination of Alessandro de' Medici in 1537 plunged Florence into immediate chaos and ignited one of the most intense battles over Medici succession. Alessandro the First, Duke of Florence, had been a controversial figure. Born in 1511, likely the illegitimate son of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, or perhaps even Pope Clement VII, Alessandro's rule was seen by many Florentine Republicans as tyrannical. He was supported by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, whose illegitimate daughter, Margaret of Parma, Alessandro had married. His strong ties to the emperor, however, made him deeply unpopular with those who longed for a return to Florentine Republican traditions. The assassin was his distant cousin, Lorenzo di Francesco de' Medici, known as Lorenzino, or Lorenzacchio, Bad Lorenzo, for his betrayal. Lorenzino, a seemingly loyal companion, lured Alessandro to a private rendezvous, promising him a meeting with a beautiful woman. Instead, he murdered the Duke in his bedchamber, believing he was striking a blow for Florentine liberty and a return to Republican ideals. However, Lorenzino's actions did not lead to the restoration of the Republic. Instead, they opened a power vacuum that unleashed a furious scramble for control of the Florentine state. Alessandro had a legitimate daughter, Giulia de' Medici, who was very young at the time of his death. Customarily, a child heir might have been considered. However, the political climate was far too unstable for a child ruler. The powerful Florentine Senate, a body heavily influenced by Medici loyalists and imperial agents, had to act swiftly to prevent outright anarchy or a Republican uprising. The key players were Cardinal Innocenzo Cibo, an imperial agent and former Medici supporter, and Francesco Guicciardini, a prominent Florentine historian and statesman. They needed a new leader, and they needed one quickly, a Medici, who could command respect and maintain order while pleasing Emperor Charles V. The contention over Alessandro's inheritance was not about his personal wealth, which was considerable, but about who would inherit the duchy itself. Lorenzino had hoped his act would dismantle the Medici tyranny, but the powerful Medici faction and the emperor had other plans. Into this void stepped Cosimo de' Medici, a young, then largely unknown, distant cousin from a lesser branch of the family. Born in 1519, he was only 17 years old when Alessandro was murdered. Cosimo had been living quietly in the Mugello region, studying and pursuing his own interests. He was the son of Giovanni delle Bandinere, a celebrated condottiero, and Maria Salviati, a granddaughter of Lorenzo the Magnificent. This lineage gave him a connection, albeit a somewhat distant one, to the main Medici line. Cardinal Cibo and Guicciardini, believing Cosimo to be a malleable and easily controlled youth, engineered his election as the new Duke of Florence. Their reasoning was pragmatic. He was a Medici, preventing rival factions from gaining power, and his apparent lack of political experience seemed to assure his complaisance. They presumed they would rule through him. This was the core of the contentious inheritance. The powerful figures who appointed Cosimo did so under a severe miscalculation of his true nature. They thought they were installing a puppet, someone whose claim to the duchy would be easily managed and whose will would simply be their own. Cosimo's inheritance was the title of duke, but the terms of this inheritance were deeply contentious from the outset. The Florentine Senate tried to impose strict conditions, limiting his power and attempting to preserve their own authority. They wanted a duke who was a figurehead, not an autocrat. They explicitly stipulated that he was to be a duke, not a prince, meaning his power would be constrained by the Senate. This was an attempt to control the succession and maintain a semblance of the traditional republican checks on power, even under a Medici duke. However, the powerful, quiet young man they had chosen quickly proved them wrong. Cosimo, despite his youth, possessed an astonishing political acumen and an iron will. He systematically began to consolidate his power, disarming his advisors and centralizing authority. He ruthlessly suppressed Republican opposition and skillfully played off the emperor's desires against the Florentine factions. He dismissed the Senate's conditions, asserting his absolute authority. The inheritance of Alessandro's dukedom was thus a contentious battle of wills. It was a struggle between those who believed they could manipulate the succession and the unexpected strength of the young man they placed on the ducal throne. Cosimo not only inherited the title, but dramatically reinterpreted the nature of that inheritance, transforming it from a potentially constrained office into the foundation of a true hereditary monarchy. The immediate aftermath of Alessandro's death saw a scramble for power, and Cosimo's rise from obscurity to absolute ruler of Florence, defying the intentions of his sponsors, stands as a dramatic testament to a contentious succession and the unexpected strength of a dark horse. Number 4, the tragic absence of a will. Piero de' Medici, often known as Piero the Unfortunate, stands as a stark example of a Medici whose death did not lead to a battle over a formal will, but rather to a profound and enduring contention over the very survival of his family's rule. Born in 1472, Piero was the eldest son and heir of Lorenzo the Magnificent. He was groomed from birth to take over the reins of Florence, a city the Medici controlled not through official titles, but through immense wealth, political connections, and the sheer force of their personality. Lorenzo, a master of this subtle art of governance, left a massive legacy of soft power, cultural patronage, and political influence. However, Piero inherited none of his father's political genius or charisma. He was arrogant, impetuous, and lacked the diplomatic finesse that had been the hallmark of his ancestors. When Lorenzo the Magnificent died in 1492, Florence transitioned from the golden age of Medici informal rule to a period of instability. Piero, despite being the designated successor, quickly alienated the Florentine elite and the common people alike. His inheritance was not a formal will, but the expectation that he would continue the intricate, delicate balance of power that Lorenzo had so carefully maintained. This inheritance was immediately contentious because Piero proved incapable of upholding it. The real flashpoint came in 1494. The King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy, intent on claiming the Kingdom of Naples. As the French army approached Florence, Piero, in a catastrophic misjudgment, rode out alone to meet the king. He offered Charles VIII humiliating concessions, including the surrender of several Florentine fortresses and the port of Livorno, without consulting the Florentine government. This act of appeasement was a betrayal of Florence's interests and a profound insult to its pride. Upon his return to Florence, the city erupted in fury. The Florentine people, already chafing under Piero's inept leadership and influenced by the fiery sermons of the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola, rose up against him. Piero and his family were forced to flee Florence, barely escaping with their lives. This dramatic expulsion marked the end of the first period of Medici rule in Florence, ushering in a long and tumultuous 18-year exile for the family. Piero spent the next decade in exile, desperately attempting to regain Florence. He allied himself with various foreign powers, primarily the French and Spanish, participating in military campaigns across Italy, always hoping to secure the means to return home. His death in 1503 was not in Florence, but in a skirmish during the Battle of Garigliano, where he drowned while fleeing after a defeat. He was only 31 years old. The contention around Piero's inheritance was not a will to be read or disputed. It was the devastating consequence of his failure to inherit and uphold his father's unspoken legacy of governance. His very death, ignominious and far from home, symbolized the profound absence of a clear succession plan or a stable transfer of power for the Medici. Without a formal will or a strong successor, the Medici family's vast assets and political influence in Florence were effectively seized by the restored Republic. Their palaces were looted, their properties confiscated, and their name, for a time, became synonymous with tyranny and exile. The period of Medici exile that followed Piero's death was one of the most contentious in the family's history. It was a desperate struggle for survival, marked by attempts to regain power through force, political maneuvering, and alliances with powerful figures like the Popes Julius II and Leo X, Piero's own brother, Giovanni. The absence of a clear, strong leader after Piero's death meant that the family's return to Florence was not a smooth inheritance, but a hard-fought battle involving multiple military invasions and the continuous pressure of papal power. Piero the Unfortunate's tragic end left a void that took years of relentless effort, strategic marriages, and brutal force for the Medici to finally fill, culminating in their eventual restoration, and later the establishment of the duchy under Alessandro. His was an inheritance, not of wealth, but of profound failure, leaving his family to reclaim their lost dominion through sheer grit and cunning, without the benefit of a guiding hand or a clear plan from their fallen leader. Number 3. The Shadow of the Magnificent. When Lorenzo de' Medici, universally known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, died in 1492, his passing sent shockwaves across Italy. He had ruled Florence with unparalleled skill for over 2 decades, not as an official duke or prince, but as the first citizen, controlling the city through his immense wealth, vast network of alliances, and his extraordinary personal charisma. Lorenzo was the quintessential Renaissance man, a brilliant politician, a shrewd banker, a gifted poet, and the greatest patron of arts and letters his age had ever seen. Under his informal rule, Florence truly blossomed, reaching the pinnacle of its artistic and intellectual glory. His will was not a document detailing his possessions, but the very system of power he had painstakingly constructed, a delicate edifice resting on his personal authority and the trust of his fellow citizens. Lorenzo had 3 sons, Piero, Giovanni, and Giuliano. Piero, the eldest, was immediately thrust into the unenviable position of succeeding his legendary father. Giovanni, the second son, was destined for the church, a path Lorenzo had carefully paved, securing a cardinalate for him at the astonishingly young age of 13. Giuliano, the youngest, was still a child. The inheritance of power was therefore clearly intended for Piero, but the nature of this inheritance was the source of immediate and profound contention. Lorenzo had left behind a formidable legacy, but also a precarious one. His personal financial affairs were in disarray. The Medici Bank, once the largest in Europe, had suffered significant losses due to Lorenzo's extensive political expenditures and his focus on consolidating power rather than pure banking. The family's wealth, while still vast, was tied up in land, art, and political ventures, not liquid assets. More critically, Lorenzo had governed by personal influence, a complex web of friendships, debts, and unspoken agreements. He had, perhaps unwittingly, concentrated power so completely in his own hands that it left little room for a successor who lacked his specific talents. Piero, born in 1472, was physically imposing and athletic, but he possessed few of his father's. He was proud, hot-headed, and lacked the diplomatic finesse that had allowed Lorenzo to navigate the treacherous waters of Italian politics. The Florentine elite, who had accepted Lorenzo's subtle control out of respect and fear, found Piero's arrogance intolerable. Lorenzo had carefully cultivated the appearance of a citizen among citizens, even while holding absolute sway. Piero, however, behaved like a prince, despite lacking the formal title. The contentious aspect of Lorenzo's inheritance was not a dispute over which son got which villa. It was the impossible burden placed on Piero to maintain a system of governance that relied entirely on an individual's unique genius, a genius that Piero did not possess. The moment Lorenzo died, the carefully balanced political system began to teeter. The Florentine government, composed of various councils and committees, quickly asserted its authority, attempting to reclaim some of the power that Lorenzo had subtly usurped. Piero found himself facing a resurgent republican sentiment, coupled with growing resentment from families who felt marginalized by the Medici's long dominance. The first 2 years after Lorenzo's death saw a gradual unraveling of the Medici's informal control. Piero's missteps, particularly his aloofness and his attempts to govern through overt authority rather than subtle influence, eroded the loyalty of the Florentine populace. The emergence of Girolamo Savonarola, a fiery Dominican friar who preached against the corruption of the age and prophesied the downfall of the Medici, further inflamed public opinion. The will of Lorenzo, therefore, was a double-edged sword. He had left his family in a position of immense power, but he had also left them vulnerable by centralizing so much authority in himself. Piero inherited the magnificent art collections, the palaces, and the bank, what was left of it, but he failed to inherit the most crucial element, his father's singular ability to rule Florence without a crown. The contention was not a family feud, but a city-wide rejection of a system that could not survive its founder. The grand inheritance of the Magnificent turned out to be a poisoned chalice for his son, ultimately leading to the family's expulsion from Florence just 2 years after Lorenzo's passing, a dramatic end to a glorious era that no formal will could ever have prevented. Number 2, the Goudy Patriarch's last stand. Piero de Medici, known as Piero the Goody due to his debilitating illness, inherited the immense wealth and informal political control of Florence from his father, Cosimo the Elder, in 1464. His will was not a document, but the very act of passing on a dynasty built on banking and subtle manipulation. And Cosimo had established the Medici as the de facto rulers of Florence, maintaining the illusion of a republic while wielding immense power from behind the scenes. Piero, born in 1416, was the designated heir, but his succession was immediately contentious due to his precarious health and the ambitions of rival Florentine families. Cosimo the Elder, throughout his long and brilliant life, had carefully cultivated a network of allies and suppressed opponents. He had funded public works, sponsored art, and built a vast banking empire that stretched across Europe. His death left a massive void. The power he wielded was informal, resting on his personal authority, the family's wealth, and their pervasive influence in every aspect of Florentine life. The challenge for Piero was to inherit this delicate balance without the robust health, or, some argued, the sheer political genius of his father. Piero's chronic gout meant he was often confined to his bed, unable to participate actively in the bustling political life of Florence. This physical weakness was immediately perceived as a political vulnerability by other powerful Florentine families who resented the Medici's dominance. Chief among them were the Pitti, the Soderini, and the Neroni families, who saw Cosimo's death and Piero's illness as an opportunity to challenge the Medici hegemony and perhaps even restore a more authentic republican government. The contention over Piero's inheritance was therefore not a squabble among family members over property, but an external threat to the Medici's very position in Florence. A conspiracy led by Luca Pitti, Diotisalvi Neroni, and Agnolo Acciaioli quickly formed. Their plan was to eliminate Piero and break the Medici hold on the city. They felt that Piero was too weak to continue the tyranny of his father, and that A strong, decisive move could finally free Florence from Medici control. Piero, despite his physical infirmity, proved to be far more astute and resilient than his enemies anticipated. He was forewarned of the plot, likely by a loyalist named Domenico di Piero Venezia. In 1466, the conspirators attempted to ambush him as he traveled from his country villa to Florence. Piero, however, was prepared. He had taken precautions, riding in a sedan chair and sending armed men ahead. His quick thinking and the loyalty of his supporters allowed him to escape the ambush. Upon returning to Florence, Piero acted with unexpected decisiveness. He called a council, purged the government of his enemies, and exiled the leading conspirators. Luca Pitti, the grand orchestrator, was eventually humiliated and politically ruined. Piero proved that, even from his sickbed, the Medici retained a formidable grip on power. His will was to maintain his father's legacy, and he did so with a surprising blend of caution and ruthlessness. Piero's rule, though short he died in 1469, was marked by constant vigilance against internal and external threats. He had to navigate the precarious alliances among Italian states and manage the immense financial responsibilities of the Medici Bank. His true inheritance was not just the family fortune, but the ongoing struggle to preserve the informal signoria his father had built. The contention was not over a will's specific clauses, but over the fundamental question of who would govern Florence. When Piero the Goody finally passed away, he had, against considerable odds, managed to secure the succession for his two sons, Lorenzo and Giuliano. His passing was not a moment of crisis like his own inheritance. Instead, it was a confirmation that the Medici, even with a physically frail leader, could weather major challenges. He proved that Cosimo the Elder's legacy of power could indeed be passed down, not just through wealth, but through a combination of political acumen, strong alliances, and a willingness to act decisively against threats. The contentious transfer of power to Piero the Goody ultimately demonstrated the surprising resilience of the Medici dynasty. Number 1. The elder statesman's unwritten decree. The Cosimo de Medici, known as Cosimo the Elder or Cosimo Pater Patriae, father of the country, died in 1464 at the age of 74. His death was not merely the end of a long life. It was the passing of the man who more than any other had forged the Medici dynasty. He was not a duke, prince, or king, yet he effectively ruled Florence for over 3 decades, building an empire of wealth and influence from his family's banking house. His will was not a document, but a complex, unwritten blueprint for a family's continued dominance, a blueprint that was immediately contentious because it relied on the perpetuation of a subtle, informal power that no piece of paper could perfectly describe. Cosimo had amassed an unparalleled fortune, but his true genius lay in his ability to use that wealth for political ends. He funded public works, manipulated elections, controlled key government positions through loyal supporters, and wielded immense soft power through his patronage of art and learning. He was the quiet power behind the Republic, always maintaining the appearance of a humble citizen while holding the true reins of power. This made his inheritance a peculiar thing. His vast properties, his art collections, his banking interests, these were all clearly understood to pass to his only surviving son, Piero. The real contention lay in whether the system of Medici rule, so dependent on Cosimo's unique charisma and cunning, could also be inherited. Cosimo had 2 sons, Giovanni and Piero. Giovanni, his preferred son, was intellectually sharp and charismatic, but he died in 1463, a year before his father. This left the sickly Piero, known as the Goody, as the sole heir to the immense and unofficial Medici Empire. This sudden shift in succession plan, caused by Giovanni's premature death, immediately introduced an element of contention. Cosimo had spent years grooming Giovanni, and Piero, despite his intelligence, was often sidelined due to his chronic illness. Many in Florence including some within the Medici family's inner circle, questioned if Piero was capable of maintaining the family's delicate balance of power. The very nature of Medici rule was the source of contention. Cosimo had carefully avoided any official title, preferring to operate through patronage, debt, and careful political maneuvering. This meant that his power was not codified in law but existed as a pervasive influence. When he died, the question was not who inherited the dukedom, but who would be able to sustain this complex informal control. Rival Florentine families, particularly those who had chafed under Medici dominance, saw Cosimo's death as an opportunity to reclaim what they considered the true republican spirit of Florence. They believed that without Cosimo's personal genius, the Medici edifice would crumble. There was no formal will and the sense of a monarch bequeathing a crown. Instead, Cosimo's final wishes were understood as a continuation of his existing political and financial arrangements, with Piero stepping into his father's shoes. The contentiousness was not a legal dispute over a document, but a profound political crisis disguised as a succession. Would the network of alliances hold? Would the Medici Bank continue to command the same influence? Could Piero command the loyalty of the many factions Cosimo had so skillfully managed? The early years of Piero's inheritance were indeed marked by significant challenges. His illness, which often confined him to bed, made it difficult for him to project the same omnipresent influence as his father. As discussed previously, rival families such as the Pitti seized this perceived weakness as an opportunity to conspire against the Medici, hoping to overthrow them and restore a more traditional republican government. The very existence of the Medici's informal rule was on trial. Cosimo the Elder's death therefore initiated a period of intense, albeit often subtle, political contention. His unwritten will was a challenge to his son. Could he maintain the family's singular position without the same health or personal magnetism? The battles that ensued were not over the clauses of a parchment, but over the very soul of Florence and its governance. Piero's surprising resilience and his ability to weather the storm of conspiracy and maintain the Medici's grip on power ultimately proved that Cosimo's unwritten decree, his legacy of informal control, could indeed be passed on. It showed that the Medici machine, though built on personal genius, was resilient enough to survive even the loss of its visionary founder, setting the stage for future generations of contentious successions.